before the world was connected by screens, before information traveled instantly, America woke up to a different sound. Every morning, a city of millions waited for the same thing: the latest words printed on paper. The newspaper was more than paper. It was power. It shaped opinions, influenced elections, and defined what a nation believed was true. But every powerful system depends on people standing at the very bottom of it. They were not editors. They were not owners. They were not the men whose names appeared above the headlines. They were the voices that carried America's news from the printing press to the streets. Millions read their words every day, but few stopped to ask who delivered them. Because history often remembers the buildings that rise, but forgets the people who kept them standing. And inside this simple image was a contradiction that shaped America. How did America build one of the world's most powerful media cultures? Through the voices of children who had almost no power themselves. But the story of the Newsboys did not begin with newspapers. It began with a city being transformed. In the second half of the 19th century, New York became one of the fastest-growing cities on Earth. Millions arrived, carrying almost nothing except hope, and the belief that the city could offer something better. But opportunity had a cost. For many families, survival depended on every person who could contribute. In industrial America, childhood was not always separated from work. For working-class families, a child's labor could mean the difference between hardship and hunger. And one industry was about to change how America consumed information forever. The newspaper was no longer a luxury for the wealthy. It became a product for the masses. The rise of the penny press turned information into something bought, sold, and carried through the streets. But newspapers needed more than printing machines. They needed human voices. And those voices belonged to some of the youngest workers in the city. They were not simply children selling papers. They were the final link in America's growing information network. Above them were newspaper empires. Below them were the children who helped those empires reach the public. The newsboy was not an exception. He was a symbol of a new kind of American city. A city where information moved faster, and where inequality moved with it. Because behind every headline was a question America had not fully answered. What happens when a society depends on children to keep its voice alive? That question would soon become impossible for America to ignore. Because the people who sold the news were about to challenge the people who controlled it. Behind every newspaper sold on the street was a machine built to create influence. By the 1890s, newspapers were no longer small publications. They had become powerful industrial enterprises. The modern newspaper combined technology, business, and storytelling on a scale America had never seen before. But printing millions of words meant nothing if those words could not reach the streets. The final step of the newspaper business was not a machine. It was a person. And that person was often a child standing on a street corner. Thousands of young sellers transformed a printed page into a living conversation across the city. They knew where people traveled, when crowds appeared, and where attention could be captured. The men who owned the newspapers controlled the stories, but the boys controlled the moment when America heard them. Publishers like Joseph Pulitzer understood something important. Attention was the most valuable currency in modern America. Newspaper owners competed not only for readers, but for the power to shape public reality. And between the powerful publisher and the ordinary reader stood the newsboy. A child on the street became the final link in one of the most powerful communication networks in American history. But power creates expectations, and expectations create conflict. Because in 1899, the people who carried the news decided they were tired of being ignored. For years, the system worked because everyone accepted their place within it. Publishers controlled the price, readers controlled demand, and the boys carried the burden in between. Their work depended on small profits from every paper sold. But in 1899, a decision by the newspaper empires changed the balance. The publishers increased the cost of their papers to the newsboys. The increase was small to a newspaper empire, but significant to a child earning pennies on the street. A few cents could decide whether a day's work meant survival or loss. And then something unusual happened. The boys stopped acting alone. They discovered the one thing they had never possessed before: collective power. In July 1899, thousands of newsboys across New York refused to sell the newspapers. The children who delivered the news became the news themselves. For a brief moment, the powerless appeared powerful. Their protest was not led by politicians or unions. It came from the streets. A movement that began with children started attracting the attention of adults. The newspaper giants had influence over the city, but suddenly, they could not control the streets. Because a newspaper empire without sellers could not reach its readers. The absence of a voice can sometimes become louder than the voice itself. The strike revealed something America was still learning. Organization creates power. These were children without votes, without wealth, and without formal authority. Yet they had something every empire needed: the ability to stop the flow of information. The question was no longer whether the boys mattered. The question was what would happen when the people who controlled the news had to listen to the people who delivered it. The strike created a situation newspaper owners had never expected. The newspapers that shaped public opinion suddenly found themselves unable to control the people who delivered their words. For publishers like Joseph, Pulitzer, and William Randolph Hearst, the problem was not simply economic. It was a question of authority. Who had the power to decide what happened next? The newspaper business depended on a simple truth: a story only mattered if someone carried it to the people. And now the carriers of the news had become the story themselves. Thousands of boys gathered, organized, and refused to return to business as usual. For once, the smallest workers in the system occupied the center of attention. The presses could continue printing, but the streets decided whether those papers would move. The conflict revealed a hidden truth about modern media. A newspaper was never only created inside a building. It was created by everyone who touched it before it reached the reader. The strike was not a revolution that changed America overnight. But it exposed a contradiction inside the American dream. A nation built on opportunity still depended on people who had very little power themselves. And perhaps the most unusual part was this: the newspapers themselves helped preserve the memory of their challengers. The same industry that often ignored these children also recorded the moment they demanded to be heard. The strike would end. The newspapers would continue. But something had changed. America had witnessed one of its first major moments when young workers forced powerful institutions to listen. But the deeper story was not only about a strike. It was about how America decided whose voices deserved to be heard. And that question would follow American media long after the last newsboy left the corner. For generations, America remembered the newsboy as more than a worker. He became a symbol, a small figure standing alone against a very large world. The image was powerful because it represented something Americans deeply valued: independence. The boy who worked for himself. The boy who earned his own money. The boy who refused to give up. This became one of America's favorite stories about success. But symbols often reveal only one side of reality. Behind the romantic image was a much more complicated truth. Many children worked not because childhood had disappeared, but because survival required everyone to contribute. In industrial America, the boundary between childhood and adulthood was very different from today. The same economy that created opportunity also created pressure. The newspapers celebrated ambition, but they rarely showed the full cost behind that ambition. The newsboy became an American myth because myths are often built from real lives. But myths can also hide what they leave out. The question was never whether these children were brave. Many were. The deeper question was why bravery was required from children in the first place. The same street contained both the promise and the contradiction of the American dream. Success was celebrated, but the struggle behind success was often forgotten. The newsboy stood at the center of this contradiction. He represented freedom, but he also represented a society still learning what freedom meant, because every American myth has a shadow. And sometimes, the stories a nation tells about itself reveal the truths it is still trying to understand. The story of the newsboy did not end when newspapers changed. Because every generation creates a new way to deliver information. But one question remains the same. Who controls the path between a story and the public? In 1899, the answer involved children standing on street corners. Today, the same question appears in different forms. The distributors of information still shape what society sees, remembers, and discusses. The tools have changed. The structure has not. Someone creates the message. Someone distributes it. Someone decides whether it is heard. The newsboy revealed a hidden truth about media power. A powerful story still needs a path to reach people. And the people on that path often remain invisible. That invisibility is part of what makes the newsboy story important. The newsboy was an early reminder that communication is never only about the message. It is also about the people and systems that carry it. The boys of 1899 did not own newspapers. They did not control the headlines. They did not control the companies. But they controlled something powerful: access. The final moment when a story entered the life of an ordinary person. And that is why the newsboy remains more than a figure from the past. He represents a question America continues to ask. Who really owns a story? The person who creates it, or the person who makes the world hear it? For more than a century, America remembered the newsboy as a symbol of determination. The young worker who stood alone, the child who earned his own way, the example of American independence. And there is truth in that image. Many of these children showed remarkable courage. But there is another truth hidden behind the legend. The question was not whether these children were hardworking. The question was why a society built on opportunity required so many children to become workers so early. The newsboy story was never only about children overcoming hardship. It was also about a system that depended on their hardship. The American dream celebrated the boy who worked hard, but history asks us to remember the world that made him work. Because every generation must decide whether to celebrate survival or build a society where survival does not depend on children. Before television, before the internet, before the endless stream of information we know today, America woke up to the voices of children standing on street corners. They shouted headlines they did not write. They carried stories they did not create. And they stood between the powerful institutions that produced information and the ordinary people who depended on it. That role has changed names many times throughout history. But one question remains: who decides which stories are heard? The newsboys of 1899 did not control America's newspapers. They did not own the printing presses. They did not decide the headlines. But they proved something powerful. Even the smallest voices can change the conversation. Because history is not only written by the people whose names appear in books. Sometimes, history is carried by the people who make sure those stories reach us. The newsboys were not the authors of America's story. But for a moment in 1899, they reminded a nation that every story has a voice behind it. And sometimes, the people standing at the edges are the ones who reveal the center of the story. History is filled with stories that were almost forgotten. Stories of ordinary people who shaped a nation without ever appearing in its headlines. If you want to discover the hidden stories behind American history, subscribe and join us for the next journey into the past.